Did you know that on a single day, in June 1944, the Allies used more than 11,000 aircraft? Or that they laid a fuel pipeline under the English Channel? We often hear the big stories, we hear about the beaches and the generals. But history is made of tiny details. It's made of things you wouldn't expect. Things like inflatable tanks, carrier pigeons, and a strange fear of crossword puzzles. The largest amphibious invasion in history wasn't just about soldiers and ships. It was an immense puzzle with millions of moving pieces. And some of the most important pieces are the ones we never talk about. What if the most crucial decision of the entire operation was made by a weatherman? What if a handful of actors and artists saved thousands of lives by putting on a show? These are the stories that fill in the gaps. They show the human ingenuity, the desperation, and the sheer strangeness behind a day that changed the world. This is not the history you learned in school. Number 25. Why were they still using pigeons? You might think that, by 1944, military communication was all about crackly radios and complex encryption machines, and it was for the most part. But there was a problem. Radios were heavy, they could be broken, and most importantly, they could be intercepted. The radio silence was critical for many of the initial units, especially paratroopers and reconnaissance teams dropping behind enemy lines. Ornamentating technology, homing pigeons, it sounds like something from a much earlier conflict, but it was a serious part of the Allied strategy. The British Royal Air Force had a pigeon section, and American forces also trained and used them. These weren't just any pigeons. They were bred for speed, endurance, and their uncanny ability to find their way home over hundreds of miles of unfamiliar and dangerous territory. Each bird was a living, breathing, top-secret message delivery system. On the morning of the invasion, bombers and paratrooper planes carried crates of these birds. Once on the ground, a soldier could write a tiny message on a slip of paper, roll it up, and place it in a small canister attached to the pigeon's leg. And then they would release it, hoping it would make it back to its loft in England. One of the most famous of these feathered messengers was a pigeon named Gustav. Gustav was aboard a landing craft on June 6th. After the ships began their bombardment of the Normandy coast, the commander of the fleet wanted to send the first report back to the UK. With radio silence still in effect for many, he turned to Gustav. The bird was released and flew 150 miles across the channel in just over 5 hours, battling high winds. His message was the first official word of the successful landings to reach British soil. For his service, Gustav was awarded the Dickon Medal, which is the highest honor an animal can receive for military service. Another pigeon named Paddy flew nearly 230 miles in under 4.5 hours, the fastest recorded pigeon crossing of the channel during the operation, carrying intelligence from a beleaguered American unit. The use of pigeons highlights the incredible mix of high-tech and low-tech solutions required for the invasion. They had sophisticated radar and code-breaking machines, but they also relied on the simple, instinctual loyalty of a bird. It was a fail-safe. When all else failed, when a radio battery died or an antenna was shot off, there was still the pigeon. Over 30 pigeons were awarded the Dickon Medal for their services throughout the war, many for their actions related to the Normandy campaign. It was a fragile, unpredictable system, but in the chaos of June 6th, it worked. But what do we still not know? How many pigeon-carried messages were actually lost to hawks, bad weather, or enemy fire? What critical intelligence never made it back, and what might have changed if it had? And was there ever a case where a pigeon fell into enemy hands, revealing Allied positions or plans before they could be acted upon? Number 24. How did an army of ghosts trick the enemy? One of the most elaborate deceptions of the entire conflict involved an army that didn't really exist. It was called the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSOG, and its job was to be seen, to be heard, and to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion was coming at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, not Normandy. To make this ghost army believable, the Allies created a special unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. This was a unit unlike any other, composed of about 1,100 artists, sound engineers, actors, and designers. Their mission was pure illusion. From their base in southeastern England, across from Calais, they deployed their strange arsenal. They had hundreds of inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. From the air, these dummies looked like a massive armored division preparing for an attack. On the ground, they were light enough for a few men to carry. But the visual deception was only part of the trick. The unit also had a sonic component. They drove around in trucks mounted with powerful speakers, blasting pre-recorded sounds of troop movements, tank columns, and construction. These recordings were made at U.S. Army bases and were carefully mixed to sound like a real army on the move, day and night. The sound engineers could even tailor the audio to the specific situation, making it sound like a tank battalion was advancing or a company of engineers was building a bridge. This sonic deception was so effective that it could fool acoustic listening posts across the channel. To complete the illusion, the 23rd also engaged in spoof radio. Radio operators would mimic the chatter of a real headquarters, sending out fake messages and creating the impression of a massive command structure organizing for the Calais invasion. They knew German intelligence was listening, so they gave them an earful. The entire operation, part of the broader plan known as Operation Fortitude, was a masterpiece of misdirection. One of the young soldiers in the unit was Bill Blass, who would later become a famous fashion designer. He and his fellow artists were tasked with creating the visual deceptions, a job that required a creative mind as much as a soldier's discipline. The Ghost Army was so successful that even weeks after the Normandy landings, the German command held powerful armored divisions in reserve near Calais, still expecting the real invasion. This crucial delay gave the Allies the time they needed to secure their foothold in Normandy. What parts of the deception do we still not understand? How much of the German command's decision-making was truly influenced by the inflatable tanks versus other intelligence streams? Were there any close calls where a spy or reconnaissance flight got close enough to see the tanks were made of rubber? And how many individual German soldiers or officers on the ground reported seeing the Ghost Army, only to be disbelieved by their superiors? Number 23, who was the weatherman who held the fate of the world? The success of the D-Day invasion did not ultimately come down to the number of soldiers or the power of the tanks. It came down to the weather. A massive storm could wreck the entire fleet before it even reached France. High winds and low clouds would make the airborne assault impossible. The wrong tide could expose the landing craft to withering fire or strand them too far from the beach. The man tasked with making the most important weather forecast in history was a Scottish meteorologist named Group Captain James Stagg. He was the chief weather forecaster for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Stagg was under immense pressure. He led a team of British and American meteorologists who often disagreed with each other. The American team, using different forecasting models, tended to be more optimistic. The British team was more cautious. Stagg had to synthesize their conflicting reports and give a single definitive forecast to the Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The invasion was originally scheduled for June 5th, 1944. But as the date approached, Stagg's forecasts became increasingly grim. He predicted high winds, heavy seas, and thick cloud cover for that day. It was a disaster scenario. Landing craft would be swamped. Bombers wouldn't be able to see their targets. Paratroopers would be scattered miles off course. On the evening of June 3rd, the invasion fleet was already beginning to move. In a tense meeting with Eisenhower and the other top commanders, Stagg presented his bleak forecast. Based on this information, Eisenhower made the gut-wrenching decision to postpone the invasion. Ships were called back to port. It was a huge risk. It risked discovery by the enemy and risked a catastrophic drop in morale among the troops who were cooped up on their ships. But then Stagg saw something. He saw a small, fragile window of opportunity. His models showed a brief lull in the storms starting late on June 5th and continuing into June 6th. The weather would not be good. He stressed, but it would be good enough. The seas would be choppy but manageable. The cloud cover would break just enough for the aircraft to operate. It was a gamble. If he was wrong, the consequences would be unimaginable. At another meeting before dawn on June 5th, Stagg presented his new, cautiously optimistic forecast. Based on this single piece of information, Eisenhower gave the final command, "Okay, we'll go." As it turned out, Stagg was right. The weather on June 6th was just barely acceptable, and right after, a massive storm, one of the worst of the month, rolled in, which would have completely destroyed the invasion had they waited. But what if Stagg had been wrong? We know the German forecasters predicted the bad weather would continue, which is why many of their commanders were away from their posts. But what if a junior German meteorologist somewhere saw the same brief lull that Stagg did, and his warning was ignored? Are there records of this? And how much of Stagg's final crucial forecast was based on hard data versus a professional's intuition or a gut feeling? Number 22. Could a crossword puzzle have wrecked the invasion? In the spring of 1944, British intelligence was on high alert for any potential security leaks. The massive buildup of troops and equipment in southern England was impossible to hide completely. But the specific time and, most importantly, the place of the invasion were the most closely guarded secrets in the world. Then, a series of strange coincidences began to appear in the crossword puzzles of the Daily Telegraph newspaper. In the weeks and months leading up to the invasion, a number of top-secret code words started showing up as answers in the daily puzzle. And it began with Utah and Omaha, the code names for two of the American landing beaches. Then came Mulberry, the code name for the artificial harbors. And then Neptune, the code name for the naval phase of the operation. The climax came in late May 1944 when the word Overlord, the overall code name for the entire Normandy invasion, appeared as an answer. This was no small matter. British counterintelligence, MI5, was alarmed. Was this a bizarre coincidence, or was a spy using the crossword puzzle to send messages to the enemy? They tracked down the author of the puzzles, a man named Leonard Daw, who was a schoolmaster at a local boys' school. They interrogated him intensely. Daw was terrified, but he insisted he had no idea the words had any military significance. He explained that he often created his puzzles by asking his students at the school to help him come up with words to fill the grid. MI5 then went to the school and questioned the boys. It turned out the school was located near a large military camp where American and Canadian soldiers were based. The boys had been hanging around the camp, overhearing conversations and picking up these strange-sounding words without knowing their meaning. They then suggested them to their teacher, Mr. Daw, for his puzzles. In the end, MI5 concluded that it was, in fact, an unbelievable coincidence. They released Daw and let the matter drop, though they watched him closely until after the invasion was successfully underway. The story highlights the extreme paranoia and the high stakes of secrecy in the run-up to the operation. Every little detail, even a daily newspaper puzzle, was scrutinized for potential threats. But does the official story hold up completely? Could one of the schoolboys have been more than just an innocent eavesdropper, perhaps prompted by a relative or someone else to pass the words along? How did words as specific as Neptune and Overlord get overheard by children when they were among the most classified secrets? And did the investigation truly end there, or are there still sealed files on the crossword panic of 1944? Number 21. What were the Rupert dolls? The airborne assault was one of the riskiest parts of the D-Day plan. Thousands of paratroopers were to be dropped behind enemy lines in the dark hours before the beach landings. Their job was to seize key bridges, roads, and German positions to protect the flanks of the invading force. But the Allies knew this would be chaotic and dangerous. They needed a way to confuse the German defenders, to make them think the airborne invasion was much larger and more spread out than it actually was. The solution was one of the stranger inventions of the operation, Rupert dolls. Rupert was not a real paratrooper. It was a small, burlap dummy, only about 3 feet tall, filled with sand and straw. But it was designed to look like a descending paratrooper from a distance, especially at night. On the night of June 5th and the early morning of June 6th, hundreds of these Ruperts were dropped from aircraft over areas of Normandy where the real paratroopers were not going. This was part of Operation Titanic. The goal was to draw German troops away from the actual drop zones. But Rupert was more than just a silent dummy. Each one was equipped with a special device. As it fell, a small parachute would deploy, and a mechanism would set off firecrackers and rifle simulators to create the sound of a firefight. Another device would release a small incendiary to destroy the dummy upon landing, so the Germans wouldn't immediately realize they had been tricked by a burlap doll. The deception was remarkably effective. German reports from that night are filled with mentions of Allied paratroopers landing in multiple locations far from the real drop zones. This caused confusion and forced the German commanders to dispatch troops on wild goose chases looking for phantom soldiers. While these units were busy hunting down the Ruperts, the real American and British paratroopers were able to land with slightly less opposition and begin securing their objectives. It was a simple, low-cost psychological trick that paid off handsomely. It demonstrated that sometimes the most effective weapon is not a bullet, but an idea that causes your enemy to look in the wrong direction. But we still don't know the full extent of their success. How many German units were specifically diverted to chase the Ruperts, and for how long were they kept out of the real fight? Were any of the dummies ever recovered by the Germans before they self-destructed? And if so, did they understand the scale of the deception they were facing? And did any of the sound simulators on the Ruperts accidentally attract real Allied paratroopers who were lost and looking for a firefight to join? Number 20, what was so important about bananas? This sounds like a strange question, but the word banana played a small but fascinating role in the story of the French resistance and their contribution to D-Day. For years before the invasion, the British Special Operations Executive, or SOE, had been working with resistance networks across France. They supplied them with weapons, radios, and training. The resistance was a key part of the Allied plan. Their job was to sabotage German communication lines, transportation networks, and supply depots at the moment of the invasion. But how would they know when that moment had come? The Allies couldn't just send a telegram saying the invasion is tomorrow. They needed a secret, coded way to give the go signal to thousands of scattered resistance fighters. The method they chose was the BBC's nightly French language broadcast. For months, the broadcast would include a series of strange, nonsensical, personal messages. Things like, the giraffe has a sore throat, or John has a long mustache. Most of these were meaningless, designed to confuse German eavesdroppers, but some were action codes. The resistance networks were told to listen for a specific two-part message. The first part would alert them that the invasion was imminent, likely within the next 48 hours. They were to prepare their sabotage plans. The second part would be the final execution order, meaning the invasion was happening now. One of the most famous of these messages was from a poem by Paul Verlaine, Chanson d'automne. The first line, Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne, the long sobs of the violins of autumn, was the warning message. Broadcast on the evening of June 1st. Across France, resistance cells heard it and knew it was almost time. Then, on the evening of June 5th, just hours before the landings, the BBC broadcast the second line, Blessant mon cœur d'une longueur monotone, wound my heart with a monotonous languor. This was the order to execute, and this is where the bananas come in. To ensure there was no confusion, there were hundreds of these messages for different groups. Another famous message pair was, it is hot in Suez, followed by the execution order, the bananas are ripe. When French resistance fighters heard that, they knew it was time to blow up railway lines, cut telephone wires, and do everything they could to sow chaos behind the German lines. The German intelligence services knew about these coded messages, of course. They even intercepted and understood the Verlaine poem. But the sheer volume of sabotage carried out by the resistance on the night of June 5th and the morning of the 6th was so overwhelming that the German response was slow and confused. They couldn't be everywhere at once. But what do we still not know about this clandestine communication? How many resistance fighters never heard the messages because of poor radio reception or German jamming? How many of the hundreds of coded phrases were misinterpreted, leading to premature or failed sabotage attempts? And did the German intelligence services ever successfully use a fake BBC-style broadcast to send a resistance cell into a trap? Number 19, how do you build a harbor and tow it across the sea? One of the biggest logistical problems facing the D-Day planners was how to supply the massive army once it was ashore. A modern army needs thousands of tons of supplies every single day: food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies. The fastest way to unload this is at a major port, like Cherbourg or Le Havre, but the planners knew the German forces would heavily defend these ports and destroy them before they could be captured. The solution was audacious. If you can't capture a port, Why not bring one with you? This was the genesis of one of the most incredible engineering feats of the conflict, the Mulberry Harbors. The plan was to construct two enormous artificial harbors in complete secrecy in Britain, tow them across the English Channel in pieces, and assemble them off the coast of Normandy. The project was given the codename Mulberry, with Mulberry A planned for Omaha Beach and Mulberry B for Gold Beach. The scale of the project was mind-boggling. The harbors consisted of several components. There were massive concrete caissons called phoenixes, some as tall as a 6-story building. These would be sunk in place to form the main breakwater. There were floating piers and roadways, code-named whales, that would rise and fall with the tide, connecting the pier heads to the shore. And there were old ships called corncobs that would be deliberately scuttled to create an outer, sheltered anchorage known as a gooseberry. The construction involved tens of thousands of workers at shipyards and docks all across Britain. The project used over 1 million tons of concrete. When the pieces were towed across the channel, it was one of the strangest fleets ever assembled, a collection of floating concrete blocks and steel roadways. The assembly process in the rough seas off Normandy was incredibly difficult and dangerous. Mulberry A at Omaha Beach was destroyed by a massive storm that hit on June 19th. But Mulberry B at Arromanches survived. It became known as Port Winston and was a lifeline for the Allied armies. In the 100 days after D-Day, it was used to land over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. It was a testament to the idea that if a solution doesn't exist, you invent it. But many questions about this incredible project remain. How was the secrecy of such a massive construction project maintained across dozens of sites in Britain? What were the alternative plans if both harbors had failed or been destroyed by the storm? And what was the long-term environmental impact of sinking dozens of ships and millions of tons of concrete off the coast of France, parts of which are still there today? Number 18, how did they run a pipeline under the ocean? Fuel. A modern mechanized army runs on it. The tanks, the trucks, the jeeps, the airplanes, they are all useless without a constant supply of gasoline and diesel. After the D-Day landings, the Allies faced the monumental task of getting millions of gallons of fuel from Britain to the advancing armies in France. Relying solely on vulnerable oil tankers was too risky. A single well-placed torpedo or bomb could create a catastrophic fuel shortage on the front lines. The answer was another secret and highly ambitious engineering project, Operation Pluto, which stood for pipelines under the ocean. The idea was to lay flexible pipelines on the floor of the English Channel, creating a direct and protected link between pumping stations in England and depots in France. It was like a giant underwater extension cord for fuel. 2 types of pipes were developed. The first was a smaller 3-inch diameter pipe called Hayes, which was essentially a modified underwater telegraph cable, but hollowed out and reinforced to carry fuel. The second was a steel pipe of similar diameter called Hamel. The challenge was immense. They had to manufacture hundreds of miles of this special pipe. They had to develop ships that could lay it, like giant spools of thread. One of these ships was a modified steamer called the HMS Latimer. The pipelines were laid in the weeks following the initial landings, connecting the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, and later Dungeness to Boulogne. The pumping stations in Britain were disguised as ordinary buildings like bungalows and even an ice cream parlor to avoid detection by enemy aircraft. By the time the operation was in full swing, the Pluto pipelines were delivering over 1 million gallons of fuel to the continent every single day. This constant, reliable flow of fuel was absolutely critical. It allowed the Allied armored divisions to break out from the Normandy beachhead and race across France in the summer of 1944. Without Pluto, the advance would have been much slower, tethered to the pace of vulnerable supply convoys. It was a hidden, silent, but utterly essential part of the Allied victory. Yet mysteries about Pluto persist. Manage and demonize the pipeline's rupture, or what was the exact blend of fuels sent through the pipes, and were there ever contamination issues, and how much of the Pluto pipe was successfully salvaged after the conflict, and how much of it still lies on the bottom of the English Channel today. Number 17, what were Hobart's funnies? A standard tank is a powerful weapon, but it has its limits. It can get stuck in soft sand, it can't easily cross a wide ditch or a concrete wall, and it's vulnerable to mines. The disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942 had taught the Allies a brutal lesson about the challenges of a frontal assault on a fortified coastline. They needed something more than just regular tanks. The British Army's solution was a collection of bizarre, specially modified tanks known as Hobart's Funnies. They were named after their creator, Major General Percy Hobart, a brilliant but unconventional military engineer. Hobart's 79th Armored Division was a menagerie of mechanical oddities, each designed to solve a specific problem of the amphibious assault. And there was the Crab, a Sherman tank equipped with a large rotating drum on the front, with heavy chains attached. As the drum spun, the chains would flail the ground, deliberately detonating mines in the tank's path, clearing a safe lane for the troops and vehicles following behind. There was the Bobbin, a Churchill tank that could unroll a 10-foot wide canvas mat over soft sand or mud, creating a temporary roadway for other vehicles to follow without getting bogged down. There was the Av Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, a Churchill tank that could carry and lay a small bridge to cross ditches or place a massive explosive charge against a concrete bunker. Perhaps the most famous was the DD tank, which stood for duplex drive. This was a Sherman tank fitted with a large waterproof canvas screen. When the screen was erected, it displaced enough water to allow the 32-ton tank to float. It was propelled by two propellers at the back. The idea was for these amphibious tanks to be launched from landing craft several miles offshore and swim to the beach, arriving with the first wave of infantry to provide immediate fire support. The American forces were offered the full range of funnies, but were skeptical and only adopted the DD tank. This decision had significant consequences on Omaha Beach, where the lack of specialized armor to clear obstacles and mines contributed to the heavy casualties. Hobart's Funnies were a perfect example of battlefield innovation, of adapting technology to overcome specific deadly challenges. But what do we still not know about these strange machines? What was the failure rate of the DD tank's flotation screens in the choppy seas, and how many sank before even reaching the shore? Were there other, even stranger funnies that were designed and prototyped but never made it to the battlefield? And how did the German defenders react when they saw a tank with giant chains whipping the ground or another one swimming towards them from the sea? Number 16, why were the glider pilots on a one-way mission? While paratroopers jumped from planes, another group of airborne soldiers arrived in Normandy in a much different and arguably more dangerous way in gliders. These were essentially engineless aircraft made of wood, canvas, and steel tubing. They were towed into the air by bomber or transport planes, released near their target, and then had to silently glide to a landing. The men who flew them were a special breed. They were not just pilots, they were soldiers. Their job was over once the glider was on the ground, at which point they were expected to pick up a rifle and fight alongside the infantry they had just delivered. It was often described as a one-way mission. The gliders were not designed to be recovered from a combat zone. They were flimsy, difficult to fly, and had to land in small, unprepared fields, often in the dark, surrounded by enemy troops and obstacles. The two main gliders used by the Allies were the American Waco CG-4A and the British Horsa. The Horsa could carry about 28 soldiers or a jeep and a small artillery piece. The landing was the most perilous part. The pilots had to navigate using only a map and a stopwatch in the dark, avoid enemy fire, and then crash land their aircraft in a field that was hopefully not filled with anti-glider poles, which the Germans had erected throughout Normandy. These poles, nicknamed Armel's asparagus, were designed to rip the wings off the gliders. The landings were violent and chaotic. The gliders would often break apart on impact, and casualties were high, but they were essential to the invasion plan. Our gliders could deliver heavier equipment than paratroopers could carry, such as jeeps, anti-tank guns, and even light tanks. They could also land a concentrated force of soldiers in a specific location, unlike paratroopers who could be scattered by the wind. On D-Day, Hundreds of gliders were used to land troops and equipment near key objectives, like the vital bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal, which were famously captured by British glider-borne troops in a daring pre-dawn raid. The pilots were volunteers who came from all walks of life. They received some of the highest flight pay, a tacit acknowledgement of the extreme danger of their job. They called themselves the Towed Targets. But what are the unanswered questions about this part of the invasion? What was the precise casualty rate for glider pilots compared to other frontline troops, a number that is still debated by historians? How many gliders landed completely off target, and what happened to the men inside, lost deep in enemy territory? And were there any instances of pilots managing the near impossible feat of repairing a damaged glider and being flown out of Normandy later in the campaign? Number 15, who were the women who broke the codes? The story of D-Day is often told as a story of men, but behind the scenes, a secret army of women played one of the most critical roles in the entire operation. At Bletchley Park, the British government's code and cipher school, thousands of women were at the heart of the effort to break the German military's most secret codes. The most famous of these was the Enigma code, generated by a complex cipher machine. But the German High Command used an even more complex system for their top-level communications, a machine the British codebreakers nicknamed Tunny. Breaking these codes was a monumental task, requiring a combination of linguistic skill, mathematical genius, and incredible patience. While the male professors and mathematicians often get the credit, the vast majority of the day-to-day work at Bletchley Park was done by women. They were recruited from universities, from the Women's Royal Naval Service Wrens, and other branches of the military. They operated the complex code-breaking machines like the bomb machines used for Enigma and the Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic computer, which was developed to help break the Tunny code. These women worked long, stressful shifts in secret huts, forbidden from ever speaking about their work to anyone, including their families. They would listen to intercepted German messages, transcribe endless strings of gibberish, and look for the tiny patterns and repetitions that could provide a crack in the code. Their work was absolutely vital to the success of D-Day. The intelligence gleaned from these decoded messages, known as Ultra, gave the Allied command an unprecedented window into the enemy's mind. They knew the locations of German divisions, their strength, their fuel supplies, and their assessments of the Allied threat. This intelligence confirmed that Operation Fortitude, the deception plan with the Ghost Army, was working. The German command was convinced the main invasion was coming at Calais. This allowed Eisenhower to proceed with the Normandy landings with much greater confidence. The work of the women at Bletchley Park is estimated to have shortened the conflict by several years, saving countless lives. Yet for decades after, their contribution remained a secret, bound by the Official Secrets Act they had all signed. Many went to their graves without ever telling their families what they had truly done. But even today, the full story is not known. How many other less famous code-breaking outposts existed, and what role did the women there play? What was the psychological toll on these women working under such intense pressure and secrecy? And are there still undiscovered breakthroughs or near misses buried in the Bletchley Park archives that could change our understanding of the intelligence war? Number 14, what was the piano player's real job? The French resistance, known as the Maquis, was not a single unified army. It was a collection of disparate groups scattered across the country with different political leanings and leaders. To coordinate their efforts for D-Day, the Allies needed to communicate with them directly. This was the job of the agents of the Special Operations Executive SOE and the American Office of Strategic Services OSS. These agents, many of them French-speaking men and women, were parachuted into occupied France to act as organizers, trainers, and most importantly, radio operators. The radio operator, often called the pianist because of the way they tapped out Morse code, was the lifeline for their resistance circuit. They were responsible for maintaining contact with London, sending intelligence reports, and receiving instructions and confirmation of supply drops. It was one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. The German forces had sophisticated radio detection teams that roamed the countryside in special vans, trying to triangulate the position of a transmitting radio. An operator could only stay on the air for a few minutes at a time before they risked being caught. They were constantly on the move, hiding their bulky suitcase-sized radios in attics, barns, and basements. The average life expectancy of a radio operator in the field was just 6 weeks. Despite the danger, their work was indispensable. In the weeks leading up to June 6, these operators sent a constant stream of vital intelligence back to London information on German troop movements, coastal defenses, and the locations of bridges and railway junctions. When the coded messages were broadcast over the BBC on the night of June 5th, it was these operators who confirmed that the messages had been received and that the sabotage plans were in motion. The massive coordinated wave of sabotage that crippled German communications and transport on D-Day would have been impossible without the courage and sacrifice of these pianists. Their women, like André Borel and Lise de Baysac, were among the first female SOE agents sent into France, proving to be exceptionally effective in this high-stakes role. They organized resistance networks and radioed crucial intelligence back to Britain. But many questions about their secret war remain. How many agents were betrayed by collaborators within their own networks? What was the true number of operators captured, and what happened to them? And did any of the intelligence they sent back turn out to be deliberate misinformation planted by the Germans, leading Allied planners astray? Number 13, why did they need millions of maps? An invasion is an exercise in geography. Every soldier, every pilot, every ship's captain needs to know exactly where they are and where they are going. For the Normandy invasion, this required a map-making effort on a scale that had never been seen before. The Allies needed maps for every conceivable purpose. They needed naval charts showing water depths, currents, and underwater obstacles for the fleet. They needed detailed topographical maps for the army, showing every hill, stream, road, and even individual houses in the landing zones. They needed aerial maps for the pilots and paratroopers, and they needed highly specialized maps for the artillery, showing precise grid references for shelling targets. The problem was, in 1942, they had very few good maps of the Normandy coast. The existing French maps were outdated and not detailed enough for a military operation. So they had to create their own. This monumental task fell to agencies like the British Ordnance Survey and the U.S. Army Map Service. They used every possible source of information. They had reconnaissance planes fly countless high-risk missions over the French coast, taking hundreds of thousands of aerial photographs. These photos were then analyzed by stereoscopic interpreters who could create three-dimensional images of the terrain, identifying German defenses, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries. They also relied on intelligence from the French resistance and even old tourist postcards and holiday snapshots donated by the British public in response to a BBC appeal. Ordinary people sent in their family photos of beach holidays in Normandy, which provided invaluable close-up details of the beaches and promenades. From all this data, draftsmen worked around the clock to create the final maps. They produced over 3,000 different types of maps for the operation. And the sheer quantity was staggering. By the time of the invasion, over 200 million individual maps had been printed and distributed. Every officer and many non-commissioned officers carried a map case with the specific sheets they would need for their mission. The precision of these maps was incredible, often down to the level of individual hedgerows, which would become a defining feature of the fighting in Normandy. Without this massive cartographic effort, the invasion would have been a blind one. But what do we still not know about this paper war? How much crucial information from the French resistance was left off the maps because it couldn't be verified by aerial photos? Were there any significant errors on the maps that led units into unexpected trouble on D-Day? And how many map makers were involved in the project, and did any of them know the full scope of the invasion plan they were helping to chart? And number 12, how did a blood drive become a weapon of war? Modern warfare is not just about inflicting casualties, it's also about saving your own. One of the great medical challenges of any major battle is treating shock and blood loss on a massive scale. By 1944, medical science had made huge advances, and the use of blood plasma and whole blood transfusions was becoming standard practice for treating wounded soldiers. But the D-Day invasion presented a unique problem: how to get enough blood and plasma to the front lines quickly and safely. The solution began months earlier, on the home fronts in Britain, the United States, and Canada. Massive public blood donation drives were launched. Posters and radio appeals urged citizens to Give a pint of your blood to save a fighting man. The response was overwhelming. Millions of people lined up to donate. A pioneering figure in this effort was Dr. Charles Drew, an African-American surgeon who had developed improved techniques for blood storage and processing. His work was fundamental to creating the large-scale blood banks that were necessary for the war effort. The collected blood was processed, with much of it being converted to dried plasma, which was easier to transport and had a longer shelf life. For D-Day, special preparations were made. The blood and plasma were carefully catalogued by blood type and assembled at collection points in southern England. The plan was to fly it directly from England to makeshift landing strips in Normandy as soon as they were secured. On D-Day itself, and in the days that followed, a constant aerial shuttle of transport planes brought in these vital medical supplies. This meant that a soldier wounded on a beach in France could receive a life-saving transfusion within hours. The availability of blood and plasma at forward aid stations and field hospitals dramatically increased the survival rate for wounded soldiers. It was a logistical and medical triumph, a supply chain of life running parallel to the supply chain of war materials. The simple, selfless act of millions of civilians back home had a direct and profound impact on the battlefield. But questions about this medical miracle remain. What was the exact spoilage rate for the blood and plasma during its difficult journey to the front lines? How did the medics on the beaches triage the use of the limited initial supply of blood? And are there records of how many specific soldiers owed their lives directly to a transfusion in the first 24 hours of the invasion? Number 11, how do you make an invasion sound real before it happens? Deception for D-Day wasn't just visual with inflatable tanks. It was also acoustic. Part of making the German command believe the invasion was coming at the Pas de Calais involved creating the sounds of a massive naval force assembling in the ports of southeast England opposite Calais. This was a key part of Operation Fortitude. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, the Allies used a variety of techniques to create a soundscape of preparation. They played recordings of anchor chains, ship engines, and the sounds of loading and unloading cargo at ports like Dover. They wanted German acoustic listening posts and intelligence agents to report a hub of naval activity pointing directly at Calais. But the most elaborate acoustic deception happened on the night of the invasion itself. A small fleet of Royal Navy launches, just a handful of boats, was sent towards the coast of France, far from the real Normandy landing zones. These boats were equipped with special electronic equipment and large waterproof speakers. Their mission, codenamed Operation Glimmer, was to simulate the sound of a huge invasion fleet. They broadcast the pre-recorded sounds of large ships moving through the water, the rumble of engines, and the clatter of equipment. To complete the illusion, the boats also towed large reflective balloons. On German radar screens, these balloons, combined with chaff strips of aluminum foil dropped from aircraft, created the impression of a massive naval convoy. The German radar operators saw what they expected to see, a large force heading for the Pas de Calais, and the acoustic listening posts heard what they expected to hear. This phantom fleet drew German naval patrols and E-boats away from the Normandy area, allowing the real invasion fleet to approach with less opposition. It was a multi-sensory deception designed to play on the enemy's expectations. By creating a believable fake invasion, they made the real one seem, at least for a few crucial hours, like a diversion. The small crews on these launches were in incredible danger, deliberately sailing towards the enemy to make as much noise as possible, but their mission was a success. But how convincing was this sonic illusion up close? Were there any German patrol boats that got close enough to see the small launches, but were confused by the loud, disembodied sounds they were hearing? How were the sound recordings engineered to be believable over open water? And do any of the original sound recordings used for the deception still exist in a forgotten archive? Number 10, why did the Allies print their own French money? When an army invades and occupies a territory, it needs a way to pay for things. It needs to purchase local supplies, pay for local labor, and give soldiers currency they can spend. Using American dollars or British pounds would have been chaotic and would have wrecked the local economy. The Allies knew that once they landed in France, they would need a special currency. So, long before the invasion, the American and British governments secretly designed and printed millions of what became known as Allied Military Currency, or AMC. This was a special set of French franc notes created specifically for use by the Allied troops in liberated France. The notes looked similar to real French francs, but were clearly marked as being issued by the Allied military. The printing was done in Washington, D.C. and in Britain. This was a sensitive issue. The leader of the Free French Forces, Charles de Gaulle, was furious when he found out about the plan. He considered it a violation of French sovereignty. He argued that only his government in exile had the right to issue currency for France. The American and British governments, however, went ahead with the plan, partly because they were unsure what kind of French administration they would find on the ground. They needed a practical solution ready to go. So on D-Day, millions of these special francs, in various denominations, were packed in crates and loaded onto the invasion ships. Paymasters went ashore with the troops, and as soon as it was feasible, soldiers were issued their pay in the new currency. The goal was to provide a stable medium of exchange and prevent the rampant inflation and black marketeering that could have occurred if soldiers had used their home currencies. Eventually, as de Gaulle's authority in liberated France was established, the Allied currency was gradually withdrawn and replaced with new notes issued by the provisional French government. The story of the invasion money is a small but important detail that shows the incredible depth of planning that went into every aspect of the operation, extending even to economic policy. But several questions remain. How much of this Allied currency was actually put into circulation, and how much was lost or destroyed in the fighting? Are there records of how the French civilian population reacted to being paid with this fake money? And how many counterfeit versions of the Allied currency were produced by black marketeers or even by the Germans to try and destabilize the economy of the liberated zones? Number 9, how did a tiny piece of film connect soldiers to home? In 1944, mail was the primary connection between a soldier on the front lines and his family back home. But sending millions of letters across the Atlantic by ship was slow and took up valuable cargo space. The solution was a system called V-mail, which stood for Victory Mail. It was a marvel of miniaturization. A soldier would write a letter on a special form, which was both the letter and the envelope in one. This form was then taken to a processing center where it was photographed and put onto a roll of microfilm. A single roll of microfilm could contain over 1,500 letters. These small, lightweight rolls were then flown across the ocean. Once they arrived in the US or Britain, the process was reversed. The microfilm was developed, and each individual letter was printed out as a small photograph, about 1/4 of the original size. It was then folded and delivered to the family. The V-mail system was a revolution in military logistics. What would have been 37 mail bags of regular letters could be replaced by a single small sack of microfilm. This saved an enormous amount of cargo space on ships and planes, freeing it up for vital war materials. It also meant that mail was delivered much faster, often in a week or two instead of a month or more. For the troops preparing for D-Day, and for those fighting in Normandy, V-mail was a lifeline. It was a morale booster, a tangible link to the world they had left behind. Getting a letter from home, even a tiny, photocopied one, was a moment of profound importance. Soldiers wrote about their daily lives within the bounds of censorship, and families wrote back with news from home. The entire system was a huge undertaking involving a partnership between the military and companies like Kodak. It demonstrated how technology could be used, not just to create weapons, but also to maintain the human connections that are so crucial in times of conflict. But what do we still not know about this system? What percentage of V-mail was lost due to transport planes being shot down or other wartime accidents? How did the censors who had to read every single letter deal with the emotional weight of their work? And are there any undiscovered caches of undeveloped V-mail microfilm stored away in an archive containing the last words of soldiers who never made it home? Number 8. Who were the men filming the invasion as it happened? Much of what we know visually about D-Day comes from the incredible bravery of a small group of men, the combat cameramen. These were soldiers from units like the U.S. Army Signal Corps and the British Army Film and Photographic Unit. Their weapon was a camera. Their mission was to document the invasion, to capture a historical record, and to provide footage for newsreels that would be shown to the public back home. They landed on the beaches with the first waves of infantry carrying heavy, bulky film cameras and wearing the same uniforms as the soldiers around them. They faced the same dangers but had the added task of trying to frame a shot, focus, and keep the camera steady in the middle of chaos. One of the most famous of these was the director John Ford, who was head of the photographic field unit for the OSS. He was present on Omaha Beach filming the landings. Another was Robert Capa, a renowned photographer for Life magazine, who waded ashore with an early assault wave on Omaha. He shot several rolls of film in the first hours of the invasion before his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't reload his camera. Most of his film was unfortunately ruined in a developing accident back in London, but the handful of grainy, blurry images that survived have become iconic. They capture the terror and confusion of that morning with a visceral reality that words cannot match. These cameramen were not just passive observers, they were active participants. They helped wounded soldiers, carried messages, and sometimes had to drop their cameras and pick up a rifle. Their work was incredibly dangerous. The simple act of standing up to get a clear shot made them an easy target. Many were wounded, and some were killed. The footage they captured was flown back to London, quickly edited, and shown in cinemas just days later. For the people on the home front, these newsreels were the first time they saw the reality of what their sons, husbands, and fathers were enduring. But the full story of their work is still incomplete. How much footage was lost, either because the cameraman was killed, the camera was destroyed, or the film was damaged by salt water? Were there any cameramen who landed with airborne units? And if so, what happened to their film? And what kind of psychological impact did witnessing and filming such events have on these men for the rest of their lives? Number 7. Why did paratroopers carry a child's toy? On the night before D-Day, thousands of American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions prepared for their jump into Normandy. They were loaded down with an incredible amount of gear rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, and a parachute. But many of them also carried a small, simple item that would seem completely out of place on a battlefield, a toy cricket. It was a small metal clicker, the kind you might find in a box of Cracker Jack snacks. It made a distinct click-clack sound when squeezed. This little toy was actually a crucial piece of identification equipment. The paratroopers were going to be scattered over a wide area in the dark. It would be easy to mistake a friend for an enemy. Shouting a password could give away your position. The cricket was the solution. The plan was simple. A soldier hearing a noise in the dark would click his cricket once. If he heard 2 clicks back in response, he knew he had found another American. The single click was the challenge. The double click was the password. This system was primarily used by the 101st Airborne. It was a low-tech but brilliant solution to the problem of battlefield identification in the confusion of a night drop. It allowed scattered soldiers to find each other and form up into small groups to attack their objectives. The sound of the cricket was distinct enough to be heard over short distances, but not so loud as to carry to a distant enemy patrol. It became a symbol of the airborne forces in Normandy. The image of a lone paratrooper hiding in a ditch in the French countryside, nervously clicking his small toy and waiting for a response, is a powerful one. It highlights the immense vulnerability and the quiet courage of these soldiers. The crickets were sourced from a British company called Acme Whistles, which still makes them today. For the men who carried them, they were a small piece of comfort and a tool that could mean the difference between life and death. But what do we still not know about this simple device? How many paratroopers lost their crickets during the violent jump, and what did they do instead? Were there any instances where German soldiers found a cricket on a captured or killed paratrooper and tried to use it to set a trap? And did the use of the cricket actually lead to any friendly fire incidents, perhaps when a response was misheard or not heard at all? Number 6. What was a Duku and why was it so important? Getting supplies from the large ships anchored offshore to the beaches was a major challenge. The smaller landing craft could do the job, but it was slow and inefficient. They had to be unloaded by hand, and vehicles had to be driven off, one by one. The Allies needed a way to bridge the gap between sea and land more effectively. The answer was a strange and wonderfully versatile vehicle called the Dukwa. The name was not a reference to the bird, but a military acronym. D meant it was designed in 1942, U meant utility, K meant all-wheel drive, and W meant it had 2 powered rear axles. But everyone just called it the Duck. The Duck was a six-wheel drive military truck that had been enclosed in a waterproof hull. It was amphibious. On land, it could drive like a regular truck, carrying up to 2.5 tons of cargo or a dozen soldiers. But when it, reached the water's edge, the driver could engage a propeller at the back and a rudder for steering, and it would motor along like a boat. On D-Day and throughout the Normandy campaign, the Ducks were absolutely essential. They were the workhorses of the beach logistics. They could motor out to the large cargo ships, have supplies loaded directly into their cargo holds by crane, and then motor back to the beach. But instead of stopping at the water's edge, they could simply drive up onto the sand, out of the surf, and continue inland to a supply depot where they could be unloaded quickly. This eliminated several steps in the supply chain and dramatically sped up the process of getting material to the front lines. They were used to carry everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies. They were also used as makeshift ambulances carrying wounded soldiers from the beaches back out to the hospital ships. The Duck was not a glamorous vehicle. It was slow, noisy, and awkward, but its ability to seamlessly transition from sea to land made it one of the most important pieces of equipment in the entire invasion. Without the steady stream of supplies brought ashore by the fleet of DUKWs, the beachhead could have easily starved. But what are the unanswered questions about this amphibious truck? What was the accident rate for the DUKWs in the rough seas of the English Channel, and how many were swamped and lost? How did the drivers, many of them from the Army's Transportation Corps, receive the specialized training to operate a vehicle that was both a truck and a boat? And are there any DUKWs that were lost on D-Day, still buried under the sands of the Normandy beaches? Number 5, why were the German commanders so unprepared? One of the great puzzles of D-Day is why the German response was so slow and confused. They had spent years building the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of coastal defenses. They had powerful armored divisions stationed in France, and yet, on the morning of June 6th, the reaction was sluggish and ineffective. Several factors contributed to this: a combination of Allied deception, German infighting, and pure chance. First, the deception plan, Operation Fortitude, had been incredibly successful. The German high command, including the top leader in Berlin, was convinced that Normandy was a feint and that the real invasion was still to come at the Pas de Calais. This belief was so strong that they held back their most powerful panzer divisions, waiting for an attack that would never come. Even after the landings began, reports from Normandy were initially dismissed as a diversionary raid. Second, the German command structure in France was divided and dysfunctional. There was a bitter rivalry between the two main commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B, and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West. They had fundamentally different ideas about how to defeat an invasion. Rommel wanted to stop the Allies on the beaches and believed the panzer division should be positioned close to the coast for a rapid counterattack. As Rundstedt believed they should be held further back in a central reserve, ready to be deployed once the main Allied thrust was clear. This disagreement meant that on the day of the invasion, the powerful armored reserves could not be moved without direct approval from the High Command headquarters, a process that caused critical delays. Finally, there was the element of luck. Rommel, believing the bad weather would make an invasion impossible, was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. Many other senior commanders were also away from their posts, attending a war games exercise in Rennes. The chain of command was in disarray at the most crucial moment. The combination of being tricked by the Allies and hampered by their own internal conflicts left the German defenders on the Normandy beaches largely to fend for themselves in the critical opening hours. But what do we still not know about the German side of the story? What was the content of the initial confused reports sent from the Normandy beaches to the High Command, and who made the decision to downplay their significance? If Rommel had been at his headquarters instead of in Germany, would he have been able to override the command structure and release the panzer divisions sooner? And are there any personal diaries or letters from junior German officers that day that reveal their frustration with the lack of orders from above? Number 4, what was the forgotten tragedy of Exercise Tiger? In the spring of 1944, the coastline of southern England was a massive training ground. The Allies needed to rehearse every phase of the D-Day landings. One of the largest and most important of these rehearsals was Exercise Tiger, which took place in late April 1944 at Slapton Sands in Devon. The beach at Slapton was chosen because it closely resembled the geography of Utah Beach in Normandy. The exercise was meant to be a full-scale live-fire dress rehearsal involving over 30,000 troops and a fleet of landing craft. But a series of communication errors and a tragic accident turned the exercise into a disaster, one that was kept secret for decades. The plan involved a naval bombardment of the beach, followed by the landing of American troops. To make the training as realistic as possible, the Supreme Commander had ordered that live ammunition be used. On the night of April 27th and the early morning of April 28th, a convoy of 8 LST's landing ship tank, filled with soldiers and equipment, was making its way across Lime Bay towards Slapton Sands. Due to a series of mishaps, the convoy was not fully protected. A British Royal Navy destroyer that was supposed to be escorting them had been damaged and was in port for repairs. A communication mix-up due to a typographical error in radio frequencies meant that the remaining escort and the LSTs were not on the same channel. In the darkness, a flotilla of German E-boats, fast attack craft, operating out of Cherbourg, discovered the slow-moving convoy. They attacked with torpedoes, 2 LSTs were sunk, and a third was badly damaged. The attack was swift and brutal. Many of the soldiers were asleep below decks, others were thrown into the frigid water. The chaos was compounded by the fact that many soldiers had not been properly trained on how to use their life preservers. Some wore them too low, causing them to flip upside down in the water. The final death toll was staggering. An estimated 749 American soldiers and sailors were killed. It was a higher death toll than the actual landing on Utah Beach on D-Day. The incident was immediately classified as top secret. The survivors were sworn to secrecy, and the bodies were quietly buried. The Allied command was terrified that the news would leak, devastating morale and potentially alerting the Germans to the location of their training areas. The story of Exercise Tiger remained largely unknown until the 1980s. But even today, the full story is not clear. What was the exact nature of the communication errors that left the convoy so vulnerable? Why was the decision made to use live ammunition during a phase of the exercise that also involved a complex naval maneuver at night? And are there still records or reports about the incident that remain classified, hiding details about who was ultimately responsible for the tragedy? Number 3, what was in the Supreme Commander's other letter? On the eve of the D-Day invasion, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was facing the most stressful moment of his career. The decision to launch the invasion was his and his alone. He had given the final go order, but he was acutely aware of everything that could go wrong. The weather could turn. The German resistance could be stronger than anticipated. The whole operation, with the lives of tens of thousands of men hanging in the balance, could fail. As he waited for the first reports from the landing forces, he took out a pen and a piece of paper and hand wrote a short note. This was not a message of victory. It was a message to be released to the press in case the invasion was a catastrophic failure. The note read, "Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He initially wrote the date as July 5th, but crossed it out. He then folded the piece of paper and put it in his wallet. This small, handwritten note is a powerful window into the mind of a commander at a moment of immense pressure. It shows his willingness to accept complete and total responsibility for failure. There are no excuses, no blaming of subordinates or bad intelligence. Just the simple, stark phrase, "It is mine alone." The letter reveals the profound burden of command and the character of the man who held it. Fortunately, he never had to use it. The landings, while incredibly costly, were successful. The note remained in his wallet, unseen by the public for years. Today, the original in case of failure letter is preserved in his presidential library, a quiet testament to the immense stakes of D-Day. But this raises some intriguing questions. Did other senior Allied commanders like Montgomery or Bradley also write similar letters in case their specific parts of the operation failed? Was there a prearranged protocol for how and when such a devastating announcement would have been made to the public? And what would the political and military fallout have been if Eisenhower had been forced to read that message to the world on the evening of June 6th? Number two, who was the double agent who secured D-Day? The success of the D-Day deception plan, Operation Fortitude, rested on the ability to feed false information to the German High Command and, crucially, to know that they believed it. This required a network of double agents, spies who were supposedly working for the Germans but were actually controlled by the British. The most important and successful of these was a Spanish man named Juan Pujol Garcia. The British gave him the code name Garbo because they considered him the best actor in the world. The Germans, who trusted him completely, knew him as arable. Pujol had an incredible imagination. He approached the British early in the conflict, offering to spy for them, but they turned him down. Undeterred, he decided to become a German spy first. He created a fake identity and convinced the German intelligence service, the Abwehr, that he was a fanatical supporter of their cause who could create a spy network for them in Britain. The irony was, at this point, he had never even been to Britain. He was living in Lisbon, making up his reports based on tourist guides, maps, and newsreels. His reports were a work of fiction, but the Germans found them plausible and valuable. Eventually, the British realized that this German agent, Arabelle, was fabricating his intelligence, and they tracked him down. They were so impressed by his ingenuity that they brought him to Britain and made him a double agent. With the full support of British intelligence, Garbo's fictional spy network grew. He claimed to have over 20 different agents working for him across Britain, all of them complete fabrications with their own personalities and backstories. He would spend hours writing their sub-reports, creating a rich and believable tapestry of false intelligence. For D-Day, Garbo was the main conduit for selling the lie that the invasion was coming at the Pas de Calais. Through his network, he fed the Germans a constant stream of reports about the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group. His messages were so convincing that even after the Normandy landings began, he was able to persuade his German handlers that Normandy was just a diversion. His most crucial message was sent on June 9th, 3 days after the landings, when he reported that the massive force at Calais was still preparing for the main assault. The German High Command believed him. They kept their powerful 15th Army waiting at Calais for weeks, a decision that proved fatal to their chances of repelling the Normandy invasion. Pujol's work was so valued by both sides that he has the unique distinction of receiving high military honors from both Britain and Germany for his services. But what are the lingering mysteries about Garbo? How much of his early success with the Germans was due to his own genius versus the incompetence of his German handlers? Did any of his fictional sub-agents ever report something that accidentally turned out to be true, causing panic among his British controllers? And how close did the Germans ever come to discovering that their top agent in Britain was actually a master illusionist working for the other side? Number one, what does D-Day even mean? We use the term D-Day almost exclusively to refer to June 6th, 1944, but the term itself is not specific to the Normandy landings. It's a generic military term that has been used for decades. And in military planning, the letters D and H are used to designate the day and hour on which a combat operation is set to begin. So D-Day simply means the day, and hour means the hour. This system is used when the exact date and time of an operation are not yet known or need to be kept secret. It allows for detailed planning and scheduling to be done in relation to the start of the mission without having to constantly update documents with a new date. For example, a planner could schedule an action for plus, meaning 2 days after the start of the operation, or to H3, meaning 3 hours before the start. So there have been many D-Days in military history for many different operations, but the sheer scale and historical importance of the Normandy invasion on June 6th was so immense that it has completely co-opted the term. When someone says D-Day, now everyone knows which one they mean. The term has become a proper noun, a name for a specific event. It's a testament to the impact of that single day. The choice of the day itself was determined by a very specific set of criteria. The planners needed a day with a full moon, so the airborne troops would have some light to see by. They also needed a low tide that was rising to expose the German beach obstacles so demolition teams could clear them, but also to allow the landing craft to get further up the beach as the day went on. These conditions of moon and tide only occurred on a few days each month. This is why the weather forecast was so critical. When the bad weather forced the postponement from June 5th, the next available window was June 6th. If they had missed that, they might have had to wait weeks, risking the discovery of their secret plans. The simple, generic military placeholder D-Day has become shorthand for one of the most complex and consequential days of the 20th century. But what do we still not know about this simple term? When was the first recorded use of D in military planning documents, and for what operation? Are there any other major historical events that were referred to as D-Day by planners at the time, but have since been forgotten? And how did the term make the leap from internal military jargon to a universally understood name for the Normandy landings in the public consciousness?